I would argue you probably don't want a ton of leads. You want high quality leads that have high probability of closing.
Today I talked to Bill Kenney. He is the founder of Meet ROI, and he focuses on helping companies that are outside of the US come into the US market and improve their sales processes, practices.
I would say there are a couple of really key challenges, and I think these are not only with people that go to events. I think it can often be in marketing in general, is lack of clarity on who the target is. We kind of think of it as prospect creep, and who they're aiming at. It tends to get wider and wider and wider, and so the messaging then to attract them becomes diluted because obviously one message doesn't fit all.
Today, Bill and I get into how you can level up your trade show experience by really treating your trade show booth and the sales experience there like a true sales and marketing challenge.
We want to have a presence, the booth communication, what is in print, what the imagery is, how people are dressed, how people communicate, should be all geared towards only attracting those prospects. And then the rest of the booth should be simple and not take away from people seeing that, because all you want them to do is come into the booth. You want them to go, I need more on this.
Welcome to Lifestyle Continuum. Let's go. You and I have worked together a little bit in the past. We met earlier this year. It was really interesting to meet you because you were representing some companies outside of the US coming into the biotech space, I think, here in the US. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that particular event was organized by London and Partners, and they were bringing over about a dozen companies to the US to explore the market and kind of learn about expanding in the US. So yeah, our role along with you is to help give them insights to the market, and particularly out in terms of growing their businesses and customer acquisition and so on. So yeah, the London and Partners, we've been mentors with them for probably 6 years or so. And yeah, they're really fantastic to work with.
Yeah, and your focus maybe specifically is in what area of that?
Yeah, so very specifically, we help international B2B and some B2G companies exhibit at U.S. trade shows. So our work, your audience is all very familiar, I'm sure, with inbound marketing. So we're an in-person inbound marketing company.
Tell me a little bit about that, because I haven't heard that before. In-person inbound marketing.
Sure. So if inbound marketing is about using online, the normal, I guess, use of the term is about using online tools to identify prospects. We use a variety of in-person events, trade shows, networking events, and so on, to help our clients identify high-quality prospects. And so our business is really built around helping our clients build a steady stream of high-quality prospects through events, through in-person interaction.
Nice. And you've been doing this for a couple of years now. So
12, 13, yeah.
How we connected was specifically for companies coming over in the life science space. And they were going to be attending some events. And I think part of what you and I were talking with them about was how to get the most out of their event experience and their presence at these shows, whether they were exhibiting or speaking or just walking the floor. And you and I had a couple of good conversations around that. And, the need in the space, that what everybody's really looking for is the need to generate, high quality traffic or conversations at their events. Are you seeing that a lot? And what are some of the challenges that you're seeing with that?
Yeah, I think I would say there are a couple of really key challenges. And I think these are not only with people that go to events. I think it can often be in marketing in general, is lack of clarity on who the target is, who the customer or partner in some cases, because obviously some people are looking to build channel relationships as well. And so, we tend to see, we kind of think of it as prospect creep, and who they're aiming at. It tends to get wider and wider and wider. And so the messaging then to attract them becomes diluted because obviously one message doesn't fit all. And we kind of look at almost, if I were going to give a metaphor, we almost look at it like fishing, if you're kind of in the early stages of market expansion, our world in terms of US expansion, we would try to answer three questions fairly early in the first 6 to 12 months of that journey. And if you think of somebody that fishes, there are three basic questions somebody that goes fishing answers before they leave their house. Number one is, what do I want to catch? That sounds super simple, but there are 34,000 species of fish. And, where we're from up in New England, codfish, very popular. There are 200 subspecies of codfish. So deciding what you want to catch is actually really important. And in fact, informs the next two decisions that you need to make as somebody that goes fishing, which is, where am I going to go fishing? Because you got to go where the fish are. It was kind of the old Jesse James joke about why he robs banks. It's where the money is. And that's, how you decide where to go fishing. And then finally, what bait do you put in the water? And so, I think it's really that where we see companies struggle is number one, knowing that those are the three kind of most important questions, but then developing the process and the iterative process to come to the right answers for those. And I think the wisdom isn't necessarily starting with the answer. It's really starting with the hypothesis and being intelligent enough to test and prove or disprove, but evolve to the right answers. Because certainly with where to fish and what bait to put in the water, 100% you won't get those right to start with. So it's really about, how do you get to the right answers?
I agree. I think categorically across the board there. Thinking about maybe the context of our conversation, looking at trade shows and conferences, some of the things that we talked about were really about that experience, about traffic and what their goals were for being present there and what they can do there. And some big challenges that they have there. So, for example, the quality of the traffic they're getting at the booth and how they might be able to improve that and improve the conversation. So you mentioned something the other day when we were speaking, and that was around taking maybe a different approach than a lot of these companies take with things like their messaging and their visuals. So talk to me about your philosophy on trade show booths and events for these companies.
Yeah, well, I think everything like this, and I think, it's a really important question. And I think everything like this needs to have a goal, a true north that you're aiming at. So the first thing we try to do is define, what output do we want from this resource, this marketing resource. So in the case of a trade show booth, in the context of a B2B sense, this is not a consumer wedding show or, something like that. This is, a business show. We see the booth, the primary purpose, or I would even say the single purpose of the booth is probably a better focus, is to identify the prospects in the room. So if you're at an event, whether it's 1,000 people at the event or 100,000 people at it, the goal of the booth is to find maybe it's a fraction of a percent of those attendees, or maybe 1 or 2% of those attendees who are prospects. And so I as a kid, I had lobster traps, and a lobster trap is sort of a multi-staged process to get a lobster into a place where they can't get back out. And the point isn't that we're capturing and tricking prospects. That's not the point at all. But the point is really that there are a variety of attractions that bring, and stages that bring, a prospect through a journey. And first is really identifying that they are a prospect. And then, of course, once you have that, then the next step and the best outcome, usually from a B2B event, when you've gotten by the first step, which is awareness, is that you want to get to a place where they agree to a meeting. And that's where you're going to do your discovery and figure out if there's a reason to maybe get to the proposal stage and so on. And each business has its own particular nuance in terms of exact stages, but ultimately you have to ask some questions and then figure out if going forward makes sense. So when we look at the booth, if the goal is to identify the prospects, essentially to separate them out from the non-prospects, then we want to have a presence, the booth communication, what is in print, what the imagery is, how people are dressed, how people communicate, should be all geared towards only attracting those prospects. So if we've decided a certain species of cod or a certain species of salmon is what we want to catch, then our bait should align with that particular subspecies. And so the same thing, that persona that we're aiming at, we should very much understand what's keeping them awake at night and have messaging that teases out or expresses to them that we hear their problem, and that whether they're challenged with a regulatory issue, which certainly could happen in life science and medical device, or they're concerned about saving lives. If they're at a doctor's conference and tired of X, sort of rate of loss or whatever the case may be. I'll give you the juxtaposition of that. The normal of what you see at booths is people promoting, whether it's their value proposition or their feature of their product. We see tons, particularly with devices, you see tons of features being promoted. And so there are a bunch of problems with that. But the first problem, and Dale Carnegie taught this to us more than 100 years ago, and that is, people don't care about you until they know that you care about them, and that only happens by what you evidence. You have to start with the problem that the customer has. But beyond that, if you kind of take it to, thinking about the fact that there are lots of other vendors in the floor, and these people are being bombarded with thousands of messages as they walk. Every hour, thousands of messages are bombarding them. So when they walk down, they see your message looks exactly the same as the last 10 booths they just walked by, whether it's the same solution or similar solution, or or not even related, but solving something in a similar space. It's still a very similar headline. So you are a brown cow in Seth Godin's vernacular. You're not standing out at all. We want to be a purple cow. We want to jump off the page, and the way you will look different. And it's funny, most people market themselves or tell you that they're solution providers, but what their headlines are totally different than that. Their product, they're product sellers. Solution providers care much more about the problem and clearly identifying it, and then working through the solution. And so the booth needs to have a bait that the prospect opts into.
All of that really resonates for me. And I think I want to make a quick point that we see exactly the same thing. And how it manifests is a company will have an idea for a product or a solution. They start, though, because they're solving a problem. They see an opportunity in the market. They go to solve the problem. And then oftentimes that's one of the last times they really think about the problem. That's water under the bridge. They're so excited about the solution. They're so excited about their particular way of approaching that problem is they don't talk about the problem anymore. And the problem is the thing. It's the connective tissue between your buyer and your seller, because that's what, until you're building a relationship, that's what you have in common is the problem. And so, like you're saying, when you lead with a solution, you're skipping a few steps and building that connection with the audience. So I really like where you're going with this. And I want to, for the people listening, a lot of companies will use a framework, an AIDA framework, AIDA, attention, interest, desire, action. And that is a valid framework when you're talking about yourself. You're raising a lot of attention. You're trying to be kind of shouty, if you will, and you think that that's what you need to do at a trade show. There's so much noise. There's so much going on. I need to be a bigger, louder shouter, if you will, not to be overly technical, but like you say, they're just missing the boat entirely, because these people are looking around. They're intelligent. They're looking at what is there for them, and you're expecting them to look at your features and know exactly that that's for them. And so your thought here in leading with the problem and having that be your hook, I think is brilliant.
I'd share two other things really quick. One is that in what we do, I have the good fortune to travel to other countries fairly frequently. And sometimes I go to countries where I don't have no reference to speaking any part of the language. And so I'm sure others have the same issue. And so I'll be, in whatever country, and I'm working with the person in a restaurant to, order food, the waits person to order some food. And as I look at them and I tell them what I would like, and when they don't understand me, my only tool as a very ignorant American is to speak louder. And I think, instead of learning their language, which is our customer, right? We want to learn their language. We absolutely reveal our ignorance when our solution is we need to see bolder print. That's the answer, right? We just need to say it louder. And it's not, it's not, we need to learn their language. And I would say that, and you and I had just a smidgen of this conversation earlier. The customer wants to talk, and it's really important we hear their story. If you put, and everybody listening, the next time you're with 5 or 10 of your customer representatives in a room, maybe from one company, or even just think about this. If you went around and every customer for every product will tell you, if you ask them, what are the 3 top things you want? One somewhere on that list for all of them will be quality. Somewhere will be, but then if you go around the room and ask each of them what they mean by quality, they will all define it differently, and it'll be from their perspective. Some will be, you need to be on time. Some will be, it needs to work. So, and each one will have a different frame of what quality is. In 50 years of selling, I can tell you that you can't sell a solution without solving something the person sees or realizes themselves. And it's so much easier when your communication aligns and you can validate or position in a way that allows them to sleep better at night. And they see that, and it's a leap better than, the world they're living in now. And the picture they have to see, and the clarity has to be there for them. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it is. I look at marketing as a conversation. There are a couple of key tenets. You have something that you want to accomplish. So you're the person who's coming to the trade show with an ask. You're looking for the customer. And when that's the case, it's up to you to begin the conversation and to start that conversation on their terms. If you were to walk up to somebody and say, hey, I have a bright, shiny new device, it's really off-putting. It really kind of sends the wrong message. And whether it's a website or it's a booth or a talk, when you begin the conversation rather than the attention-seeking approach and more on the commonality, which is our shared problem, then it's easier to establish alignment and credibility, and you're talking at their level on the things that they care about first, which really is sets you up for success later on. So I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah. Well, and I would say too that, I think we have to agree on what a prospect is, because I kind of started by saying that tends to be prospect creep. So we very specifically define a prospect as somebody that has a need, they have money or budget, and they have urgency. And so the ultimate test for your booth is, if you're not in it, who gets attracted to it, right? So I think that's because we see people in trade shows that, are standing in the aisle and pulling people in. So they're pulling in sort of the average attendee. They're, grabbing people and bringing them in because they want a demo, right? I get measured by how many demos I do. I think I would suggest changing the metric to how many post-trade show or how many post-event meetings with high quality prospects do you set? I mean, for most, sales cycles are long enough. It's hard to use sales as a basis to make sort of decisions in terms of how an event was. But the leading indicator of that is certainly quality appointments, and sort of at bats. How many runs are we going to score? Well, how many at bats do we get? That's usually a much better measure. So look at that first appointment as an at-bat.
Yeah, you were saying the other day that, a lot of times, biz dev or sales will go to a show and they'll come back with a stack of business cards and think, yeah, I won that. But then you go to, connect with those people, post-event, and none of them return your emails. None of them make the connection. And so what feels like a win really isn't. It's like, how many likes did I get on that LinkedIn post? Like, it doesn't mean anything. It's the how many conversations are started, how many people actually engage and respond in the conversation. I really do look at collecting business cards like a vanity metric. My son collects Pokemon cards, right? It just doesn't mean a lot. What's important is, am I getting meetings booked out of that? And, to your point, you're getting everybody coming into the booth. That sounds really good to, a head of a company, a founder, or, the leadership team. It sounds good. We had a lot of traffic at the booth. Great. What does that do for us?
It actually keeps our prospects from coming in.
Right. You think about the person who really wants to know about that. They're only going to stand in line to talk to somebody for so long. It's a trade show. The context there is really important. People, I hear all the time, we did this thing at a trade show booth and people loved it in the context of the trade show booth. Let's do that elsewhere. Well, it doesn't work elsewhere. And things that may work online in that environment don't necessarily fire at an event experience. But I like that. What we get to, though, is we get to, AIDA is a common copywriting framework, and we use it for a number of different things. But you brought this really unique perspective, which is use that maybe not just as a framework instead. It's an effective framework to use maybe in the booth, and we could talk about that, but as your entire strategy for your experience. And I really like that, in that it's not just limited to copy. Like, let's extend a problem agitate solution framework instead to that bigger environment. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
As you go through the process to get the messaging right, to attract prospects in, we see that ends up transcending sort of all communication. One of the cool things that can happen in a booth that generally can't happen when you do this online or in other media is that when somebody opts in, when they come in, you can ask them why. And when they don't, you can also ask them why. If I understand that this isn't critical to you, this particular thing that we're focused on isn't critical. But what is, if they're in the profile of a persona that you would imagine aligned, well, what are you struggling with? What are the big things that, you're focused on today? But the intelligence you can get at events is fantastic. And your ability to iterate, one of the things we've seen thinking about the expansion stage where you're, kind of entry and growing, is most companies will, identify their big event, and that's, or the big 3 events nationally, and they'll go to those. We found it much more productive for them to have a local and regional strategy in that first 6 to 12 months for a variety of reasons. One is they're much less expensive. You're talking about hundreds of dollars versus tens of thousands of dollars. You can sleep in your own bed at night. The time efficiency is much, much better. And you'll learn from that how productive were these. And the frequency of those is much greater. So they're going to happen every week or every month, whereas the national events just happen once a year. So I think of like Hunt for Red October, when the guy said, just one ping, and that's what you get. You don't, the feedback and the ability to iterate, not just the messaging you have on your booth or what you might have in your collateral, but how your team speaks. Who are they targeting? What do they say? What's the value proposition? What's the valid business reason for a meeting? All of those things will evolve, but they don't evolve without some frequency of, sort of exchange, and sort of it's, kind of periodically throwing up and then coming back and throw. It's much better to have a good game of tennis or ping pong where you're, sort of getting that frequency, and this you're not just trying to upscale or upskill the communication, but it's the team too. They're both their competence and confidence at communicating. So I think it's really thinking about how do we use the tools, because all the same people are going to local and regional events. It's just a matter of picking the right ones and having a good strategy.
That's an interesting, a little bit of interesting food for thought. So when I'm working, with my clients, a lot of times they've got a limited budget, they've got a small team, Even a $50 million a year medical device company, they're trying to be really careful with how they're spending their money, and what they're looking at trade shows only through the lens of lead gen. And they'll get people to the booth, they'll get the stack of cards, and they'll think that was boom or bust. But one thing I haven't thought about, and you make a really good point about this, is that if you only go to bio, or you only go to your specific industry event, and that's your one event, well, you're saving a bunch of money on events, but you're giving your team zero opportunity to test messaging, to do a dry run, to practice. And so it's really this all or nothing experience. And that's not a good customer experience. You want your people to know their information, but it's not good for the team either, because they don't develop that familiarity with it. They don't get that practice. They don't know what messages resonate. You have to be better prepared. You have to have it nailed before you go to that one event every year. So I like your idea of going to maybe smaller regional events, picking a couple of key targets, maybe a smaller event in like a Cambridge or a Boston, as opposed to a big giant event. And then practicing, honing some messaging there and trying things out. And I like your reference of you get to drive home and go sleep in your own bed at night. But learning the data you get from those experiences, those conversations. You think about marketing. We try to test everything, and we can do a lot of that in social media and with content now. You would never go heads down for a year and then say, okay, on this one day, we're going to blast out all of our ads and all of our content and all of our everything. And wow, just whatever happens with it, that's going to be our thing. Right. And then, walk away from it from another year. You test it, you see what works, you iterate, and your approach to using smaller shows, rather than saying, well, we're not going to get a ton of leads there, it's not worth our investment. That's your research. That's your R&D. That's your place to check, check your messaging and your positioning and see if it resonates with the customer.
And I would argue you probably don't want a ton of leads. You want high quality leads that have high probability of closing. The thing I would add to this, and I would actually start with this, to us, the most important of all these sort of strategies, the top of the pyramid, and actually the biggest fail point we see for sort of growing companies is the lack of customer density. And so building a strategy that again, looking at that until you have a repeatable model, I would say, is the sort of measure of when we would see it's best to shift out of this. But the first, and again, it could be 12 months, or for some, maybe 24 months of focusing locally and regionally, kind of starts very simply with the idea that sale one, no matter what you're selling, is hard. And sale 100's hard. We know that. But the only way sale two is easier is if there's some proximity to sale one. There's some referential opportunity. Either we learn something that we can apply, there's a story we can apply, there's some iteration in our communication we can apply. The product gets better because of what we heard in sale one, and sale two accepts that more. But that proximity is easier. And what we mean by proximity is geography. So ideally in a kind of a fenced-in area. The U.S. is way too big. The elephant, you'd never eat an elephant all in one bite, right? So you have to break it down. And the other is very likely an industry or subsets of industries in terms of focusing. But the idea being that if the goal is to scale, in other words, to kind of go from having a single lane, one or two people selling, to having 10 or tens and potentially hundreds of salespeople, you kind of go from, that single lane road to the Autobahn. But the only way you figure out the right road in the right direction and the right speed is by, getting enough throughput. And And it's much easier to get the second sales rep up if you can take them on a tour and have them meet a bunch of customers in a dense area. So not only do the sales get easier, and they're never easy, but sale two gets easier because of sale one. Sale three gets easier because of the first two, only if there's some proximity, if there's some sort of relationship between them, and then the idea being that much easier to get that second person up to speed if there's a dense geography or a dense set of customers. You get them so that they learn the language to speak because you've learned you know the language to speak. And I'll give you one quick example. I talked to a founder of a company who's been in the US for 3 years. This is just a couple of weeks ago. I talked to this guy. He has more than 100 customers, and he still doesn't feel like he has a repeatable model. He's selling every one of these. He's sold by himself, and he's beside himself. And the reason is because all of his customers are spread across the country, and they're in 11 industries. And so he's sort of solving sort of something for a lot of different people that have nothing to do with each other. And so what they're learning is very siloed and sort of unrelatable to, each sale is just as hard as the first. We keep getting examples of how important customer density is. But I think, then the strategy for local and regional makes sense. And then, sort of the strategy for iteration and, sort of more velocity in terms of your connection with prospects. And then you're going to find partners easier. And, because it's not just the message, but it's the frequency of the message that, if you're going to see people monthly or every couple months, that frequency also helps. Where you go to bio and it's that one ping once a year, and they may not see you because there are 100,000 people there. So we're at that dinner event for a life science group in your region. You'll meet everybody if you go to a couple of events.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think that we see similar things where you have companies that they go out to launch, they hire a small core sales team. We're going to have this person cover this territory, this person over in this territory, and that person over there. And they are spread thin. They're not supported. It's really hard to, as a founder and as a small team, support all of everything logistics related around that. And there's a common theme that as I go through these interviews and I talk to founders and I talk to people like you, is that founders are just really stretched thin, and that the actual product or the science it's important, but it's definitely not the most important thing when growing a business, because that's got to be your focus now. And your ability to grow a team and support a team is critical to success. So if you can spin up and target a core small area and put those resources there and really focus and grow that, then you have something that you can pick up and repeat and scale. And I like that a lot. I like the theme of customer centricity and trying some things out and experimenting and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Well, I mean, think of how the franchise model works. The first thing they do is they establish a company store. And what is the company store? Mm-hmm. That's the model for the rest of the stores that get. And they bring everybody into the company store to sort of, drink the Kool-Aid and learn the processes and all that kind of stuff. So, I think it's the same thing. And if the founder's stretched, the founder's going to be really stretched with 3 salespeople spread all over the country. So hire one, put them, in your office and get them successful. And they become the model for everybody else. And I'd say, at least from what we see, the founder needs to be ready to, or a founder needs to be ready to be very involved for the first 6 to 12 months in selling with that person. They don't need to set the appointments. That person can do that, but they need to be out on a lot of those meetings, because they have all of the knowledge and the institutional information, but just as much they need to hear what the customer's saying and being able to bring that back, both because it may iterate the product, but there are going to be adjustments to how the marketing communication happens, and they're going to have the credibility to get the changes made that maybe the new salesperson, won't have the trust or, credibility or relationship. A lot of those things are really important. About 6 months ago, we wrote a paper on, we call them the three truths, but there's sort of three lessons we don't need to learn again. And that's actually number one, the idea of customer density being important in the early stages.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Kind of bringing it back to the thing that my audience is looking to this particular episode for, how do I get more out of my attendance at these events, and how do I fix my booth? Not just the physical presence of the booth, but the kind of the entire experience, and thinking about that presence at a trade show differently. We're talking to people who don't know what they should do with their booth. Yeah. They don't know how they should design that experience and what they should be getting out of it. So, you have a ton of experience and thoughts on that. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So let's think about first the person you want to attract. So let's say roughly half the people walking down the aisle at the trade show are introverts. The others are looking up. But the point is anyone walking by is absorbing lots of messages. So somehow yours needs to speak to them. And the goal, again, is just simply to attract. The best booth is going to be one that attracts prospects, people that have a need, money, and they're urgent. And ideally, those that don't have all three of those qualities continue to walk, because you want a pipeline that's high velocity. You want high quality prospects. And this is what you don't see online. You don't see the people that don't click to download the white paper or what. But this is part of the exercise. Is actually quite often you're better off when people walk by if you have the right messaging. And so the message that we found best, and think of like driving down the road and seeing billboards. What billboard gets you to turn in and write down the phone number? It's going to be one that, if you're driving at 60 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour, depending on your speed, right, or your translation, is that it's going to be, it has to be a probably 2 to maximum 5 word headline. One of the most famous ones in the U.S. is "Got Milk?" ? And that somebody with a milk mustache on it, and people got it immediately. But so it's think of and how you kind of figure out or have a hypothesis on what should be the headline is think about your persona, that person you're trying to attract, and what are their big challenges, and ultimately what's their biggest, what's the thing that is vexing them the most, is costing them getting their bonus or keeping them awake at night or anything like that. And we often find that that the statement starts with tired of X, or concerned about Y, ? But it usually, we've just in testing over the last many years, and we A/B test all the time. We'll go to like one-day trade shows, and in the morning have a specific banner booth set up, certain headline, and while people are at lunch in the afternoon, we'll actually set up a totally different booth with a different headline. So we A/B test very frequently. So by far the best performing, and this is measured against setting appointments with qualified prospects after, that's our only metric, are going to be thoughtful questions that prospect responds to. So have that headline, and then below it is an image that somehow supports that. The rest, everything else in the booth should not take your eye, should not bring your eye in. In other words, your eye should, as you're walking by, the first thing your eye should be attracted to should be the headline and an image then that supports it. And a friend of mine calls this the dead seagull image, which I think is, if you think of an oil spill that just happened, a dead seagull with oil all over it. And again, it could be a very negative image of the problem. Or it could be an image of the solution. I think, again, it depends on your persona, but you want to test these things. The only right answer is what your customer responds to. And if you fish, that the bait you need changes, it evolves. So there are seasonal baits. I mean, people that go fly fishing don't go with one fly. They go with literally 10 or 20 or 30 flies, and they'll change them out and see what that fish is responding to best. And so, but the simple answer on the booth, provocative headline that is very customer or prospect centered, an image that supports it, and then the rest of the booth should be simple and not take away from people seeing that, because all you want them to do is come into the booth. You want them to go, I need more on this, and anything else that's there should support them coming in for that. So the more, we're doing a lot of assessments now of people's booth setups, and we just assessed one where they had all sorts of machines set up, and the banner had a whole bunch of logos on it, and it had a statement that just made no sense at all, and all sorts of bullets underneath it, and I had no idea where to look. It just, you just were like, this is way too busy, and I don't know. And it was easier to just go to the next booth and sort of figure out what they do. So I think that's sort of the idea is really, and I think you can get into things like, do we have a giveaway and all that, but again, the only measure you should use is, does it attract our prospect? And so the opt-in might be a webinar or some content that helps them, with the question that you posed. In other words, concerned about X regulation or whatever. Then it's all right. Come to our webinar on that issue, and then people that sign up for that have the problem. It's kind of a simple thing.
Right. Let's go back to the positioning and messaging for a second. Yeah. So we're talking about problem, starting customer centric and the problem that they're experiencing. What companies typically do is they use more of an attention getting approach, which I think is fine. But it's really an attention getting approach on their particular technology or their therapy or their solution. And so they kind of miss the boat here. What we're talking about instead is something that is directly relevant to them. And so as an example, what I would say is we're working right now with a company that is one of the only labs in the US that provides a particular test. And it's a test that augments traditional blood tests for clinical trials. So this is a highly desirable test, and it's a test that can be conducted many, many times. A traditional blood test in a clinical trial is a needle stick, and you get data out of that, but you get limited data, and there are only so many times you can stick a participant. And the other piece of that is when you get a vial or a handful of vials of blood, you only have so much blood to work with. So you have a limit, and it's a natural limit, and it's what the market deals with today. And there's a need for more data. There's a need for more dynamic data than you might get from a couple of key tests there. And so they augment that. And some of the historical messaging for them is getting into the leading with the features of the test. We can do this, and we can do that, and we can do this. What they struggle a little bit with is connecting with the audience, because the audience doesn't have a point of reference for those things, because they have a traditional test that sort of establishes their framework for conducting clinical trials. And so they're opening up a whole new avenue, and they are solving a problem, but they don't talk about the problem at all. And the problem really is limited data and the impact of the test on the participant. Mm-hmm. And so what in this case, with your example, what we've done for them is reposition their marketing recommendations on the website, their booth, to lead with identifying the current limitations. Now, we're not demonizing blood tests. Mm-hmm. We're not replacing what you're doing today. Mm-hmm. What we're doing is we're augmenting it. Mm-hmm. You're getting more. You have a problem. Maybe you don't realize it's a problem, but part of the challenges you face are related to that. and we open up this whole other avenue. And so that's an example, without getting too specific on it,
Sure.
of exactly what you're talking about. And companies don't do this enough.
Yeah, and I would even think, I'm not asking this to reveal the company, but I would even think thinking down so that the lack of data is probably just a symptom of the actual problem. But what's the, you kind of think of the fishbone diagram, right? So ultimately, what's the lack of data? What happens when, when there's less data in a world without their solution? Do people die earlier? Are the mortality rate higher? Is the, what's the result? But I think, to me, I would think about that and maybe test some headlines, or concerned about, or whatnot.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And what we find is different companies in different markets have different tolerances. So in this case, again, without revealing much, there's no tolerance for hyperbole and anything that might paint the audience as you're maybe not getting or not doing, or any part where they're a problem, or what they're doing today is a problem. And so that hyperbole, and at a base level, we go right to what is the logical conclusion if we continue down this path of this problem, right? Oh, you're never going to discover that therapy because you don't have the data. That extreme hyperbolic kind of vision of the natural extension, it doesn't, where it might in another market make a ton of sense, because there's more of an emotional appeal, and we can relate to that. In this space, right, it's almost reporting on the problem. You draw the conclusion.
Right. I wonder if asking something like "Wish you could X." Yeah, less confrontational, but more supportive or collaborative.
All of that, as long as, like you said, you're connecting with the problem first, and you're explaining and educating on the nature and the depth of that problem, and then you're pulling them in,
right.
And you have a solution to it. Your solution actually does
totally
solve it.
Yeah, no, and every audience has sort of its different nuance, for sure. It's not you. It's terrible to make assumptions. And I think we see that as companies cross borders too. As not only is it different in different industries and sub industries, but the customs in different countries are different in terms of being direct or indirect.
100%. So one final thought for the audience. We've got life science companies, healthcare companies. One key takeaway for them, words of wisdom.
It's really simple. First and last, think about the customer, think about the person you're trying to attract. And again, it might be that prospect and that persona. It might be you're building channel partners, but what's their goal? What's keeping them awake, and sort of build everything you do. And we're obviously focused mostly on the sort of the in-person, but everything around the communication with them, being really empathic to their concerns, their world, the things that somehow give them joy, and use that as the method to connect and build a relationship, and ideally to be able to sit down, break bread, and figure out if you can do business together.
All right, Bill, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Bill.
So if you're a life science leader or product manager and you have an interesting story you'd like to share, reach out to me on LinkedIn and we'll connect. If you're interested in learning some other lessons in marketing for life sciences, or in avoiding some of the big mistakes, I cover a lot of that in my LinkedIn newsletter. So I'll drop the links to those in the description below. That's it. That's the end.